All right, great. So as Scott said, my name is Liz Gartman. I'm a regional crops educator in Sheboygan, Fond du Lac, Washington, and Ozaukee counties. And we wrote a grant last spring regarding optimizing forage quality and yield in Wisconsin, and we were funded through the Midwest Forage Association research proposals. So the importance of this project is really kind of piggybacks on what Mike was talking about and looking at the value of first crop forage here in Wisconsin. And we know that first crop forage makes up the largest percentage of forage yield for the season. I have the old data on here because I don't have didn't have Mike's report for 2025. But typically we're looking at about half, 2.08 dry matter tons per acre of our forage is coming from that first cut. When we consider the value to that to dairy and livestock rations, that's a big chunk. About 36% of the total dry matter for the year can come from that one cut. And we know, as we look at the value to dairy diets, oftentimes this, while it may not always test as hot as some of the later cuttings that we have, it does tend to feed pretty well and helps drive some milk production. And we also know that targeting that first crop harvest correctly sets up the remaining 2 to 3 harvests. And Mike showed some of that data regarding when subsequent harvests have happened. One of the other things that we included in this trial was winter cereal data, because we do have limited winter cereal information on forage quality. We need to build on that, and this was a good first step to get some more of that data put together. And as Mike indicated as well, that May weather is really unpredictable in Wisconsin, and it has a big effect on what our quality and our opportunity really to get this forage harvested might happen to be. So some of the key objectives we had was looking at correlations between peak stick measurements and lab reported relative feed values, provide a database harvest management guidance to forage growers to optimize that first crop forage while maximizing dry matter yield, targeting winter cereal and cover crop harvest management and forage quality. And then we did take a little bit of a look at the WISCOnet data and trying to figure out where appropriate these growing degree days, soil moisture, and soil temperatures might play into some of these predictions. So what we did, similar to Mike's project, is we identified some partner growers in fields, and we did have, even before we put this project together, obviously we had a lot of regional educators that were doing scissor cuts, especially on alfalfa. But this was really our opportunity to bring it together into one really data collection piece and having all that information put together in one spot. So the measurements that we took were peak stick measurements, and that was obviously on the alfalfa side of things because we don't have a peak stick measurement calibration for the winter cereals. We looked at crop height, and we collected the crop growth stage as well. And then each one of these, you can see our scissor cuts there in the picture. We took a scissor cut at harvest height and submitted them to Dairyland Labs. The results that we recorded were the RFB, the RFQ, the crude protein, the ADF, and the NDF digestibility. And when we wanted to start taking these measurements, we were shooting for about a 13 to 15 inch crop height to start pulling those measurements. Typically was about the second week of May this year. And then depending on the site, we had a variable number of samples that were pulled. So in most cases, we were sampling weekly, 1 sample per week. With some additional funding we had from other sources, some of these sites were tested more often. So where did we sample? And again, just like Mike's map, this is not a perfect indication. We had more sites than this, but if they ended up in the same county, I just put 1 star for the most part. But I felt like we covered a good chunk of the state. We have a little bit of a gap in the middle here, but really we got more of a statewide effort than what we've had in the past as far as sampling goes in these scissor cut projects. So before I dig into what the results were, we did do some outreach as well, kind of in real time on this project, because the value in the scissor cuts really was to report to growers what was going on in their area. So this is an example of something that I put on a website and I send out via email, but the educators involved typically are sending something like this out via email, putting it in a mailer, putting it on a website so growers can take a look at how the crop was progressing in their area. And then we also partnered with the University of Minnesota Extension system. They have a really nice visual database that growers can go and check out. So you can actually manipulate this tool and take a look at your area, and you can see that there's graphs and charts based on what data is feeding into that. And you can make selections at the top of the page there that will feed into that chart and into those graphs. And then, of course, we provided some grower reports to the growers as we went through the season as well. We provided them with their forage sample analysis reports as well as a report at the end of the year. So some of the results that we got into is when we looked at the alfalfa cuttings, we were trying to determine that correlation between the peak stick value, plant maturity, and then that lab reported relative feed value. And then our goal was to support some of the confidence in the peak stick accuracy and not an indication that they're not accurate, but depending on the growth stage of the plant and the height of the plant, which we've seen some variance in the past couple of years, we weren't sure exactly where we were targeting. So you can see in alfalfa, we had 136 total samples that we took. And when we look at it on our vegetative correlations between the peak stick RFE and the lab RFE was actually okay. And of course, that's where we had the most data points as well. But when we got into the early bud and the bud stages, you can see that we really didn't have great correlations there. So not a boatload of data points to work with, but it gives us a little bit of confidence that we can see that maybe there is some correlation that we can rely on in the vegetative stage, but we need to be more careful when we get into the early bud and the bud stage. When we look at the winter cereals, of course, there's no peak measurements, only lab analysis, and this was just a couple of sites up in the northeastern part of the state. And we had 13 samples that were taken at 3 different sites. You can see the green line was the Oneida Nation farm had a cereal rye triticale mix. And then the other 2 sites, the orange and the blue, were just straight cereal rye. So when we looked at the crude protein levels, and of course, crude protein is one of the key metrics that we look at when it comes to nutrition and feed quality for livestock. We can see that actually the blue cereal rye started out pretty high early in the month, but it's pretty amazing the rapid decline that we saw in that sample as we went through the season. And then I will note that there was a little bit of a variation as well in the varieties of rye that we see here. And there was an Albon rye that was in here that had a slightly higher crude protein level than the variety not stated rye. So there may be some differences that we need to try to account for based on varieties, not just the fact that we have a cereal rye versus a triticale mix. And then we look at RFQ, we can see, and I will make a comment on the crude protein. We had some sampling, I don't want to say challenges, but it just goes to show that we never quite get exactly the same spot because we've already harvested, then we get some variation, especially at the beginning of the sampling data. When we get into the RFQ, you can see that again, we had some ups and downs in the orange cereal rye line based on probably where we sampled in that field. And then our blue line here, it was a pretty marked or pretty straight line in that decrease of quality that we had there. And then finally, one thing that we wanted to take a look at, because we know that we can harvest cereal rye not only for heifer feed, that was a common thing, is to consider that cereal rye was just going to make boatloads of heifer dry cow feed. We actually can maintain some fairly good NDF digestibility on our cereal rye if we're paying attention, and our triticales, if we're keeping a close eye on that quality. And one thing to note here is in the blue line with the Sunny Days Dairy cereal rye, the rye was actually harvested around this 5/22 date. But Kevin Jarek, who was the person working on that site, they actually left an area just to see how much the decline would continue in that NDFD. And that's this 5/27 sample here. So we can see a pretty marked decrease in NDF digestibility, which is no surprise to most folks probably watching this webinar. So we did use or try to look at some Wisconsin data. This is just a screenshot of the website from the other day. If you haven't used Wisconsin before, it's a really great resource for weather information. We were able to pull down some of the historical data for each of these sites to try to make some correlations between what the weather was doing at the time and what our quality was doing. The state climatology office actually said that we had a temperature whiplash in May. And if you remember, the first 2 weeks of May were actually pretty temperate and pretty nice. And then we got into the third week of May and it got pretty cold and wet and really slowed down the progress of our forage crops in a lot of parts of the state. So we're hoping that we're maybe better able to leverage the Wisconsin information moving forward as we get more data points on this particular project. So some of the challenges that I will mention that we had with this the first year of this project is that variable May weather. In a couple of sites in the southwestern part of the state, we only got 1 or 2 samples because it got dry and the crop was progressing pretty quickly. So growers had harvested that already. We had a cold and wet week, that third week of May, that delayed development. And kind of similar to last year's first crop forage, it really stretched out without losing a whole lot of quality longer than what we thought it probably would. So that was kind of an interesting assessment we had for another year in a row. I will say that especially in my area, we probably could have gone another week and not seen a significant decline in quality, but a lot of my growers cut by Memorial Day anyways, because that's the timing that they anticipated cutting anyways. So we did have limited late bud and early bloom samples because of that. It would have been interesting to see if we would have gone another sample where we might have ended up. And of course, we could use some more winter cereal sites. The ones that we had were concentrated up in the northeastern part of the state. But honestly, that winter cereal could be its own project and could use some more data points. And overall, you know, to see further success in this project, we'd like to have just more years, more site years, more data points that we can work with. So some acknowledgements. I want to thank the Midwest Forage Association and their research program funding. Dairyland Laboratories had provided some of the in-kind funding on this project. And then some of the additional assistance and funding we had, the Fond du Lac County and Outagamie County Forage Councils. We had some sampling help from the Tilth Agronomy Group, Much Crop Consulting, and Kevin Nays with Dairyland Seed. And then, of course, thank you to the regional educators that gathered the samples and submitted them, as well as the participating farms. Obviously, we can't do any of this work without their cooperation and their help. So we really appreciate that opportunity. Moving forward, if you happen to be interested in partnering with a regional educator to get involved with this project, it would be great for you to reach out to the regional educator in your area. You can find those on the website. Alternatively, you can always reach out to me. I'm happy to gather some of that information so that we can look for more collaboration and more partnership. I would also say that if you're already doing some of this collection in the area, or you have growers that are collecting this information, we'd love to just have you collect that data and submit it to us. And we can always have that conversation as well. So that is going to wrap up my presentation. Scott?